In the spring of 1886, General Nelson Miles took command in Arizona and put 5,000 soldiers into the field, nearly a quarter of the United States Army, plus 500 Indian scouts. He was hunting 38 Chiricahua Apache men, women, and children. But here's the twist. What beat those soldiers was almost never a rifle. It was a set of tools so ordinary that the Army looked past them. At number 13, a warrior cut an Army telegraph line and then repaired it himself, and the Signal Corps lost weeks. And number 1 could not be captured or bought. The Army spent 20 years trying to copy it. Some of it broke the rules of war, as Washington understood them. All of it worked. Before we start, hit subscribe, because the Army left most of this out of its own histories. Let's count down 25 ingenious Apache weapons that outsmarted the U.S. Army. Number 25, the Wiki-Up. In the Chiricahua and Dragoon Mountains of southern Arizona, an Apache camp went up in an afternoon and disappeared in 10 minutes. A woman and her daughter cut oak and willow saplings, bent them into a dome about 7 feet across, lashed the frame with yucca fiber, and thatched it with bear grass. Nothing in that house could not be replaced by the next hillside. The camp sat on ridge crests where a rider crossing the flat below was visible for the better part of an hour, and where 3 or 4 ways out ran down the back slope. When cavalry finally reached a rancheria, what they usually reached was ash and warm ground. Officers filed reports about burning 30 lodges and counted the day a victory, while the families who had built them were 2 mountains away by dark, cutting saplings again. The Army learned to burn villages. The Apache had learned long before never to need one. Number 24, the arrow poison. 19th century soldiers and settlers across the Southwest wrote home about it with a kind of horror that reads strangely now. The mixture reported by ethnographers and by Army surgeons was decomposed deer liver worked together with rattlesnake venom, and in some accounts, crushed red ants, centipedes, and scorpions were added to it. The paste was smeared on the iron point and on the foreshaft behind it, and then the arrow was left to dry. A hit almost anywhere in the body meant a wound that would not close. In an era before antiseptics, before anyone in a field hospital understood infection, a trooper could take a shallow arrow wound in the thigh outside Tucson, ride back to the post under his own power, and be dead of it 11 days later in a canvas tent. The arrow was not asked to kill the man. It was asked to take the week that followed. Number 23, the sinew-backed bow. The Apache bow ran short, roughly 40 to 50 inches, cut from oak, mulberry, mesquite, or juniper, and often bent into a double curve. Sinew was laid along the back and set with a glue boiled from hooves and hide, which let a short stave throw an arrow far harder than the wood alone could manage. A man could carry that bow through brush on horseback, or lying flat in a wash, and use it in country where a rifle barrel would have caught on everything. It made no flash and no smoke, and in a canyon it made almost no sound at all. Long after every Apache band carried captured firearms, they kept the bows, because cartridges ran out and arrows could be made sitting by a fire. A rifle announced to the whole valley exactly where a man was standing. The bow told nobody anything. Number 22, the horse that was also dinner. Lieutenant John Burke, who rode with General Crook and wrote down what he saw, put it plainly. The Chiricahua could count on covering 60 to 75 miles in a day because they stole fresh horses continually and killed the ones they had worn out. To the cavalry, a horse was capital. It was grain-fed, shod, inspected, entered in a ledger, and it had to come home alive, or somebody wrote a report about why it had not. Troopers dismounted and walked their animals on grades to spare them. An Apache war party did the opposite, running a horse to the end of its usefulness, then butchering it on the spot and going on with the meat, because horse and mule flesh was considered the best eating there was. The cavalry rode carefully because it had to bring the horses back. The Apache never intended to. Number 21. The cane arrow and the barrel hoop point. The shaft was cut from river cane, straightened over heat, and fitted with a hardwood foreshaft that carried the point. That joint was the clever part. When a wounded man or a surgeon pulled the shaft, the cane came away in his hand, and the foreshaft with the iron head stayed behind in the muscle. Barrel hoops, wagon tire, sheet metal off a burned freight wagon, the strapping from a supply crate, all of it could be cut and hammered cold into a barbed head and lashed on with wet sinew that shrank as it dried. Every wagon train hauling flour and cartridges into Arizona was also hauling arrowheads. It just did not know it yet. The Army looked at a broken wagon and saw a loss. The Apache looked at it and saw a supply of iron. Number 20, the rawhide war shield. It was made from the thickest hide on a bull, cut in a circle, soaked and shrunk over a slow fire until it drew up hard and dense, and sometimes doubled with grass or hair packed between two layers. Painted across the face were the signs a man had a right to carry: sun, lightning, hail, the water beetle, the marks that tied him to his own power. On the arm it was held slanted, never square, and that angle was the whole idea. A ball that struck flat would punch through, and a ball that struck at a slope would skate off the hide and away. It only had to change the direction of one thing at close range while a man closed the distance. The shield was never built to defeat a bullet. It was built to make one glance. Number 19, the mescal pit. An agave heart, trimmed of its leaves, went into a rock-lined pit over hot stones, covered with grass and earth, and cooked for 4 days. What came out was sweet, dense, and portable, and once dried it kept for months and traveled without spoiling. By food value it sat close to oats, and it grew wild across the whole range the Apache used, on the same slopes they were already crossing. Burke found the roasting pits everywhere in the Sierra Madre, at village after abandoned village, the way another officer might have found stables and granaries. A column of cavalry could only go as far as its pack train, and its pack train went only as far as the next depot. An Apache band was walking through its own commissary. The Army moved on a supply line. The Apache moved on a plant that was already growing where they were going. Number 18, the lance made from a cavalry blade. A war lance ran 12 to 14 feet, cut from a sotol stalk or a shaft of light, seasoned wood. And at the end of it went whatever steel the war had made available. A cavalry saber cut down. A bayonet. A Mexican sword blade, taken off a dead lancer a generation earlier and kept in a family. The join was wrapped tight in wet rawhide, which dried down onto the wood like a steel band and never worked loose. Mounted, a man could reach a soldier well before the soldier could reach him, and in the closed brush of a canyon bottom, a lance could be used from horseback, where a long gun was useless. Some of those blades had been forged in Toledo and in Springfield, and they finished their working lives pointed the other way. Washington shipped the steel west at its own expense. The Apache only changed the handle. Number 17, the war club. A rounded stone chosen for its heft was sewn into wet rawhide and joined to a short handle by a flexible neck, so the head whipped forward at the end of the swing and hit far harder than the arm behind it. Some were made from the jawbone of a horse, the teeth left in. It was a weapon for the last 10 feet, for a sentry, for a man cornered at the edge of a camp in the dark, and it worked without a sound that would wake anyone else. There was nothing in it to run out of and nothing to break. A trooper's ammunition was issued, counted, and eventually exhausted, and when it was gone, he had a heavy stick with a sight on the end. An Apache who had fired his last cartridge had not finished fighting. A cartridge could be counted, issued, and used up. A rock could not. Number 16, the pitched water basket. Apache women coiled a jug from sumac or willow then sealed it inside and out with pinon pitch until it held water like a canteen and weighed almost nothing. It went on a carrying strap over the shoulder, and it did not clank against a saddle ring the way an army canteen did. More important than the jug was the map that came with it. Apache children were taught the tinajas, the natural rock tanks that hold rainwater in the desert for weeks after the sky has cleared. And they were taught the seeps and the plants that told a man where water sat close beneath his feet. The army moved between the water it had marked on its maps, and the Apache moved through the water nobody had mapped at all. Soldiers rode from one known spring to the next known spring. The Apache rode through everything in between. Number 15, the crown of grass. Burke watched Apache scouts do it and wrote it down almost with admiration. A man would bind a sheaf of grass or a handful of brush around his forehead, and then, disguised that way, crawl like a snake to the top of a ridge and study the country below without ever showing a human outline against the sky. Stripped to a breechcloth and moccasins, dust rubbed over the skin to kill the shine, an Apache lookout could lie inside rifle range of a column for an hour and be taken for a clump of bear grass by every man in it. Soldiers on that frontier learned to distrust the landscape itself, which is an exhausting way to spend a summer. Officers wrote about a country that seemed to be watching them. It was. The army went out looking for men. The mountain kept showing it grass. Number 14, the smoke column. The Apache ran a signal code with fire that carried information, not just alarm. A single steady column meant attention, gather, look here. 3 or more columns rising together meant danger, enemy, a body of troops in the country. The fires were built for the message. Damp grass and green brush for a slow white column, pine cones and resinous cedar when a fast black one was wanted, and a blanket over the fire cut the column into readable pieces. Riding into the Sierra Madre with Crook, Burke saw a thread of smoke climb off a knoll ahead of the column and watched his own scouts answer it within minutes by heaping cedar on a fire. Word crossed 40 miles of mountains, while the Army's message was still folded in a courier's pouch. A dispatch rider needed 2 days and a fresh horse. A signal fire needed 4 minutes and a boy. Number 13, the telegraph line cut and mended. By the late 1870s, the Army's real advantage in the Southwest was wire. Military telegraph lines between the forts of Arizona and New Mexico territory let a commander learn in an hour what had happened at another post, concentrate columns, and cut a raiding band off before it reached the border. So the Apache cut the wire and then did the thing that made it brilliant. Rather than leave a gap a repair crew could spot from horseback, they cut the line up close against the pole and tied the 2 ends back together with a strip of rawhide. From the ground, the line looked whole. It ran unbroken to the eye for as far as anyone could see, and it carried nothing at all. Crews rode out and climbed pole after pole across empty desert, hunting one leather splice that might be 40 miles away. Columns sat waiting on orders that had already been sent. Officers argued about equipment failure while a band crossed into Mexico at leisure. The Army's fastest weapon was a copper wire. It was defeated by a bootlace. Number 12, the signal mirror. Long before the Signal Corps built anything, Apache scouts were flashing messages off polished surfaces. Sheets of mica, quartz split flat and rubbed bright, plates of native copper, and later trade mirrors and window glass taken in raids. Held to the sun, tipped in a pattern, a mirror will throw a readable flash across a valley in a fraction of a second, and it can be relayed peak to peak by men who never come within miles of one another. In 1886, the Army finally built the answer, a heliograph network of stations across Arizona and New Mexico. One of them on the mountain they named Heliograph Peak, throwing messages 90 miles at a stretch. The Signal Corps wrote it up as a triumph of modern communication. Apache boys had been doing it with a chip of quartz and a wrist. Number 11, The stone breastwork. On the 15th of July, 1962, about 150 warriors under Cochise and Mangas Coloradas waited above Apache Spring while a column of California volunteers marched up the pass. The Apache had spent time on that hillside. They had built rock and willow breastworks, commanding both sides of the only water for miles, including a circular work roughly 30 feet across that Sergeant Albert Fountain described after the fight. They held their fire until the soldiers were between 30 and 80 yards out. It was the closest thing to a prepared defensive battle the Apache ever fought against American troops, and for a day it held until Captain Roberts dragged 2 mountain howitzers up and put shells into the rocks. They had built the position perfectly. Nobody had told them a cannon could be carried up a mountain on a mule. Number 10. Holding the water instead of the ground. In April of 1880, 2 companies of Buffalo soldiers of the 9th Cavalry under Captain Henry Carroll rode into Hembrillo Basin in the San Andres Mountains and straight into Victorio. About 150 Apache had the high ground, but Victorio did something more patient than fight for it. He put riflemen on the springs. Then he waited in New Mexico in April on ground where a man on foot burns through his canteen before noon. The troopers were pinned through the day without water. Carroll took a wound, 2 of his men were killed, and 7 hurt, and the fight only broke when reinforcements and White Mountain Scouts came up the following morning. Every officer in the Southwest thought in terms of terrain. Victorio thought in terms of thirst. He never needed to beat the cavalry. He only had to keep it from drinking. Number 9. The scatter. When a band was pressed hard, it stopped being a band. On a stretch of rock or gravel that would hold no print, the group broke apart into ones and twos, each riding or walking a separate line out, and every one of them knew a place and a time to be 100 miles ahead. There was no discussion of it at the moment, because it had been agreed on days earlier. A pursuing officer who had been following a clear trail of 40 people came around a shoulder of rock and found 40 trails of one running in every direction across country that would not hold a track in any way. He had to guess, and guessing meant splitting his own force, and splitting his own force in Apache country was how officers got written about afterward. A trail is something a group leaves behind. Take away the group, and there is nothing left to follow. Number 8. The raid instead of the battle. This is the piece the Army took longest to understand. For the Apache, the raid was an economic act, not a military one. A party went out to bring back horses, mules, cattle, ammunition, and food, and it was judged on what it brought back, not on what it destroyed. Killing invited pursuit and revenge, so a good raid was one where nobody on either side was hurt at all. That meant a war party would disengage the instant the price went up, breaking off a fight it was winning, because winning it was worth nothing. American officers, trained on Napoleon and fresh from the Civil War, kept trying to force a decisive engagement against an enemy that had no use for one. They brought a strategy built to destroy an opposing army. There was no opposing army. The Army was counting bodies. The Apache were counting horses. Number 7. The boot moccasin. Apache footwear came up over the knee in a soft high boot with a heavy rawhide sole and a stiff disc turned up at the toe, and it was 3 pieces of equipment in one. It was a shoe, it was a legging against cactus and rock and snakes, and folded down it made a pouch for whatever a man needed to carry. It left a print an Apache scout could read like a signature, and a cavalry trooper could barely see. A man on a raid carried a spare pair on his belt, because that country ate footwear, and he could replace them himself out of a deer hide and an awl. The Army shipped brogans from contractors in the East in sizes that fit nobody and lost more men to ruined feet than to arrows. The Army issued boots by the crate and still limped. The Apache made their own and kept walking. Number 6. The captured repeating rifle. The Apache did not manufacture a single firearm or a single cartridge. and by the 1880s, they were among the best armed irregulars on the continent because the United States supplied them. Guns and ammunition came off raided pack trains, out of ranch houses, off dead men, from traders who sold cartridges the way they sold flour, and out of the agency issue itself. When Crook's scouts hit the Chiricahua camps in the Sierra Madre in 1883, the property Burke recorded taken included 4 nickel-plated breech-loading Winchester repeaters and a new model Colt revolver. That was better than what a good many troopers were carrying, since the Army had issued its cavalry single-shot Springfields to save on ammunition. Every crate of rifles the War Department sent west was a crate that might be opened by somebody else. Washington armed both sides of that war and only ever meant to arm one. Number 5, the women who carried the war. The Army wrote its reports as if it were fighting men only, and that was a failure of observation with a real cost. Lawson, the sister of Victorio, rode with his band as a fighter and a scout for years, and her own people spoke of her as a shield to her people and credited her with a power for locating the enemy. Dateste, a Chiricahua woman who rode with Geronimo's band, was a hunter and a warrior who also spoke English, and she carried messages between the holdouts and the Army during the last negotiations of 1886. Between them, they did the work that decides campaigns and never appears in an order of battle, moving intelligence, handling the talks, riding the same ground and the same distances as the men. Both of them ended up on the prison trains to Florida with everyone else, and Dateste survived Florida, Alabama, and a bout of tuberculosis, and lived on for decades at Mescalero. American officers spent 20 years looking for the man who was leading them in circles. Twice at least they rode right past her. Number 4, the Sierra Madre itself. The mountains of northern Mexico were not a place the Apache retreated to. They were a weapon they had been maintaining for generations, and they knew every tank, every pass, and every blind canyon in them. Crook crossed the border on the 1st of May, 1883, with 193 Apache scouts and only about 50 American soldiers, because he understood by then that regular cavalry in that country was little more than baggage. The scouts set the pace and chose the route, and the soldiers went where they were led. The trails ran up rock faces so steep that Burke rode a horse losing its footing would roll hundreds of feet to the bottom. The stronghold, when they finally stood in it, was a natural amphitheater, with the wickiups scattered and hidden around the walls, and Burke admitted in print that the capture or destruction of the entire band could never have been accomplished there. He was standing in the enemy's fortress and writing down that it could not be taken. Most armies have to choose their ground when the war starts. The Apache had chosen theirs a century early. Number 3, the 1,000-mile walk home. In the late summer of 1886, the Army settled the Apache question by loading the Chiricahua onto prison trains for Florida, and it put the Apache scouts, who had just served it faithfully, into the same cars. One of them was Masai, a Mimbres man of about 40. The train ran east through Albuquerque, Lamy, and Raton, and with every mile, the country outside the car got greener and stranger. Somewhere in Missouri, past St. Louis, hundreds of miles from any land he had ever seen, he got out of a moving railroad car and started walking west. He had no map, no horse, no rations, and no companion. He traveled by night, navigated by the stars, slept hidden through the daylight, took what he needed from farms and ranches as he crossed them, and stayed off every road in 5 states. Roughly 3 months later, he walked into the Black Range of southern New Mexico home, while the men who had shipped him east assumed he was in a stockade on the Gulf Coast. The Army had a railroad, a telegraph, and a fort every 100 miles between Missouri and Arizona. It still lost a man to the dark. Number 2, the Apache Scout. By the early 1880s, George Crook had reached a conclusion that made him unpopular with much of his own officer corps. Regular troops would never catch Apaches. Only Apaches caught Apaches, so he recruited them by the company, put them in the field ahead of his soldiers, and let them run the pursuit their own way. Burke set down the reason without flattery or apology. He wrote that the two great points of superiority of the native soldier over the representative of civilized discipline are his absolute knowledge of the country and his perfect ability to take care of himself at all times and under all circumstances. A scout drew a Springfield, 40 rounds in a belt, a canteen, a butcher knife, an awl, and a numbered tag. And with that he did what a supply column of 200 men could not. It was scouts who found the strongholds. It was scouts who talked Geronimo in. And when it was finished, the War Department loaded those same scouts onto the Florida trains beside the men they had tracked, still holding their honorable discharges. The Army beat the Apache only by admitting that it could not. Then it punished the men who had proved it. Number 1, the trained body. It was not carried, it could not be captured, and no ordnance board could requisition it. An Apache boy's education was physical and relentless. He was made to run up a mountainside in the cold with his mouth full of water, and at the top, or back at the bottom, in front of the man training him, he spat that water out on the ground to prove he had breathed through his nose the entire way and never once opened his mouth to gasp. He wrestled. He went without food on purpose. He slept without a blanket in November. He was sent out alone and expected to come back. A boy who could not hold the pace stayed behind, and every family in that camp knew which boys those were. By the time he was old enough to ride on a raid, thirst was an inconvenience, and distance was nothing at all. Burke, timing them, found that scouts on foot held 4 miles an hour, hour after hour, and that a band with stolen stock covered 60 to 75 miles in a day across country that broke shod cavalry horses in a week. That was not conditioning. That was a road network built into a man's lungs. Put that against the arithmetic of the last campaign. In May of 1885, Geronimo left San Carlos with 35 warriors and about 109 other people, many of them women and children. Against them, the United States put 5,000 soldiers, 500 scouts, thousands of Mexican troops, heliograph stations on the peaks, and a railroad. And it took 16 months, 2 international borders, and the better part of a quarter of the army. And in the end, nobody captured them. Geronimo walked into Skeleton Canyon in September of 1886 and surrendered on terms because he was tired and his people were finished, not because anyone had run him down. 5,000 men chased 38. The 38 decided when it ended. From a sealed water jug to a strip of rawhide on a telegraph pole, these 25 weapons share one thing. Almost none were built to kill anybody. They were built to make an enormous, well-armed force arrive late for 20 years, and the Army's only real answer was to hire the people who invented them. Tell me in the comments. Have you walked that country in Arizona, New Mexico, or Sonora? And does anything in your family's story touch this war on either side? And give me your opinion. The scouts brought Geronimo in and the War Department put them on the prison train anyway. That knowledge was never lost. It was left out of the histories, and out on that ground, it is still true. It is time we started listening again.